Okay, so this is Bold New Democracy on Thursday evening, April the 23rd. I was going to say March. I'm not even in the right
Wednesday.
month. So we have Representative Karen Brownlee and Representative Dani Isaacsohn this evening to discuss the issues at the Ohio State House, the state budget, and Senate Bill 1. So I'll turn the floor over to Karen just to give her opening comments for a second here, and then we'll ask Dani for his comments. So thanks, Karen. Go
Yeah,
right ahead.
thanks for having me. So with this budget, I think that probably the best one-word description is just it's a very cruel budget. The top lines that I see are that it does quite a bit to broaden the gap between that equity gap between those who have and those who do not have. It I think another really frightening element of it, and I'll just keep my top lines really quick here, is that it is in a lot of ways, some ways it's increasing information, but a lot of ways it's restricting information and access to information, particularly from the health department, unless it's about abortion, and then they want more data collected on that. And then the final piece is that the way a lot of the financing and the funding is structured, it simplifies it. So kind of unvetted ways to very random funding. And it creates a situation where there's a lot of consolidation of financial power, even more, over last biennium, but consolidation of financial power at the state house by the legislature through the General Revenue Fund. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dani. I'm sure you have some other thoughts, big thoughts about this budget.
Yeah. So first of all, nice to see everyone. A lot of friendly faces. Appreciate you hosting this, and Greg, I am horrible at correcting people on this, but it is spelled Danny but pronounced like Sunny with a D, Dunny.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. So I'm gonna try and I'm gonna try and get specific about the budget and be a little sort of like, I'm gonna try not to be alarmist about it. I'm gonna try and give you sort of a sense of like, because I do think there's a lot of that. There's enough of that to go around. So it could have been way worse. In fact, I expected it to be way worse given the shift in Republican leadership. The ways in which it is most harmful are more hypothetical than real at the moment. So in terms of big picture. So right, the big things the state does are Medicaid and public education. Right? Those are the two huge buckets of the state budget. Within Medicaid, the single most harmful thing in the budget is something the governor put in, very uncharacteristically, which is it's trigger language around Medicaid expansion. So right now, the deal on Medicaid expansion is that there's a 9-to-1 match from the federal government. The governor put language into the budget that the House not only kept in, but actually strengthened, that would say that if the federal government goes even a single dollar below that 9-to-1 match, Medicaid expansion ends immediately for 800,000 Ohioans. So again, that's not guaranteed to happen. It's dependent on the federal government, but it is insane. It's cruel. It's bad to use, what Karen's talking about, like it's bad policy. It doesn't make any financial sense. It would not only would it keep 800,000 people from healthcare coverage, it would shutter rural hospitals and FQA, federally qualified health centers. It would be devastating. And so that is the single worst sort of big picture thing I think in terms of human harm that could come out of this budget. And then as it relates to let me back up actually a little. As it relates to things that we fund, basically the move that the Republicans made was to flat fund as much as they could so that they could say these are not cuts. And this is, for them, the advantage of having a new Speaker of the House who plans on being there for 8 years, which is that he can play the long game. So on a lot of these things, he's cutting off their knees in this budget so that he can cut off their head in the next budget. And so with public schools, we have a fair school funding plan that finally attempts to use a real formula for what is it to calculate what it costs to educate a child, and then have a rational basis for how much money every school district gets. We are in year 4 of a 6-year phase-in of the funding. Because of the massive spike in real estate prices and because of inflation, it did lead to a much bigger jump in school funding from the state than we thought at the beginning of the 6 years. So there was sticker shock at like what it would take to update years 5 and 6 and finish fully funding the formula. The Speaker of the House does not like the formula. And so basically step 1 of killing the school funding formula was to just say, you know what, we're going to flat fund all the schools. There's no rational basis for that. There was a rational basis when we had those funding levels 2 years ago, but inflation for school-related expenses has gone up 15%. School enrollment has shifted, right? And so we need to update the form. You input the costs and then you update the formula, and then it adjusts how much every district gets. Instead of doing that, basically the House opted to go back to the way schools used to be funded, which is called residual budgeting, which is basically saying no one gets a cut. It's not based on anything. It's not adjusting to anything. And so that does a few things at once. One, it's a death blow to the school funding formula. And 2, actually, if you flat fund schools when they've had 15% inflation, it's a cut functionally, right? $1 buys you less. And most of that inflation for schools has not been in salaries, which is the bulk of school costs. Where the inflation, teacher salaries have gone up 2.7%. Inflation has been 6% over this time period. So it's actually been slower than inflation. Where the skyrocketing costs are on health insurance and supplies. And so that's what's really driving this big increase in school costs. So by flat funding them, it's functionally a cut. So that's, in terms of school funding, that's what happened. Same move in the libraries, right? They're flat funding libraries. So technically, libraries are not getting a cut in terms of absolute dollars, but they're changing the funding formula. So they're delinking library funding from overall state revenues where they've been linked. And one of the things that has protected library funding is that it's connected to state revenue. So step 1 in this budget, delink them. Step 2 in the next budget, once it's an individual line item, then you can cut. It's much easier. So and then the last thing I'll say on schools is the most harmful school funding policy is they're calling it property tax relief. But schools have reserve funds. They're called carryovers. And because of the way levies draw down over 5 years, because of the unpredictability of school funding from the legislature, responsible districts save money and have businesses call it, what's your runway, right? How many months can you go without new profit? And what the legislature did at the last second, no debate, as none of us have ever even heard of this idea, is they put a cap of 30% carryover for all school districts. And they said, if you go above 30%, and by the way, 486 of the 611 school districts in the state are above the 30%. If you have above 30%, that money needs to get returned to taxpayers. And so if enacted, like if it went into effect as drafted and as passed by the House, it would be the single largest cut to school funding in Ohio history overnight. We're talking about billions of dollars, and it's billions of dollars that schools have squirreled away to be able to not have to go to the levy every year, or to a levy every year, and so it would be devastating. Now, do I think schools could find a way around it with creative financing? Do I think it would force them to spend recklessly so that they get? Yes. It would do all sorts of negative public policy things, I don't think it would even be a massive property tax relief because that's just not how it would play out. But it was an attempt to have a political talking point that would actually do real harm with no real thought. And then there's a whole bunch of horrible policies in the budget that are just culture war, abortion, LGBTQ, gender stuff, menstrual products, stuff that's like, what is this doing in the state budget? So obviously it's 4,000 pages. It's almost $100 billion. There's more to get into, but that's kind of big picture on Medicaid, on schools, and on some of the policy areas. What we spent a lot of time negotiating, but I'll sort of leave it where I ended it, which is it not only could it have been way worse, it was way worse. We spent huge amounts of time getting a lot of really bad stuff out and making a lot of the bad stuff less bad. So I actually I'm really proud of our caucus and proud of where the budget landed because I saw how much worse it was. And if we were not there, that's where it would have ended up, and it still could in the Senate. So,
And if I may jump in here just to explain the process, the governor's budget came out, and we had what was it, 3 weeks to go through the entire budget to hear testimony in each of the standing committees that hears the budget. So there are 13 standing committees that heard budget testimony. And it was a very, very short time period because that original governor's budget was almost 4,000 pages. So the process was rushed significantly. Then after it went through the standing committees where we worked with the ranking members and Democrats and the chairs, the Republican chairs and vice chairs, to go through it, see what we thought was good, what we thought could use some work. After that process, it then all funneled through the finance committee. So Dani sits on finance committee, and they heard, I don't even know how many hours of testimony, probably it must have been hundreds of hours of testimony in an incredibly short timeline. And then we all submitted our amendments, what we wanted to change. And the Democratic caucus put in tremendous effort. I give a lot of credit to Representative Sweeney, who is the ranking member on finance. And, we broke up the work, but we went through every page, every line of that budget to see what was in there so that we at least knew what it was. Unfortunately, it did not seem to be the same on the other side of the aisle. That rush for many members on the other side was no big deal. Their leadership told them what was in there, and they chose to not. Many of them chose to not dig in. So the system was definitely rigged from the get-go, from the process. Once the testimony and the process went through the finance committee, it then went, I believe, into conference. Is that correct, Dani?
No, it will go into conference committee once
it comes back.
Once the Senate votes theirs out.
Okay, thank you for correcting me on that. And but basically it went back to really the chair of the finance committee, who's Rep. Stewart. They worked whatever they wanted to put into it with the speaker and other leadership. It came back to us. I think they revealed it in the morning to the Republican caucus of that Tuesday before we voted. And then we saw it the afternoon before we voted. So we really had no idea what surprises they were going to add to it. And, the total sum of it was that they did everything they could so we wouldn't know what was in this budget. Despite that, I think we worked pretty hard. I don't know how many hours of sleep you guys missed on finance. I know we missed several in the standing committees alone. So I can't, they made it as opaque as possible. And that again points to what Dani was saying, what I was saying. They really are working to, I think the scariest part about this budget is have consolidated oversight over the state's budget including, taking more monies away from local communities. Not only did they get rid of local government funds several years ago, but this time around with the cannabis tax. So communities that open themselves up to opening cannabis stores in their neighborhoods were promised an excise tax. This budget came back and actually took almost half of that money back to the state GRF, and that's good for 5 years. So it's a very short-term promise, and really the State House is reneging on its promises to local governments.
Well, thanks for the overall description. Yeah, it's crazy. But last month at the North Area Hills Dems meeting, we had some of the school board members come in, and I'm surprised when Dani was describing the school funding that you didn't mention anything about vouchers. So one of the things that Dr. Moffett had discussed was that the school voucher amount is going to go up this year, if I understood her correctly, at least for Cincinnati Public Schools. And she was mentioning that in the 88 counties of Ohio, I think she said 17 of them have charter or private schools. The other 70 do not have any charter or private schools. So in essence, those rural counties are going to be losing funding for schools that will be going to charter schools that are mostly located in urban or suburban areas. So can you address that? Either Dani or Karen address that if that's the case. Did I understand that correctly? And is that funding going to be increasing for charter schools, and is the funding then coming out of public schools?
If I may, yes. So the private school vouchers, which started last year, amounted to just under $1 billion. So that $1 billion of school funding was taken away from public schools. And I think that the scariest part, I do want to point out one really good piece. And I know that Rep. Isaacsohn, I know Dani worked on this, was that there was included in this budget performance metric for private schools. It's not great, but at least we're on some sort of track to compare performance data of schools who are receiving these vouchers. The really scary part about this budget, and I think this one probably makes me the sickest in the pit of my stomach, is that they are now opening up vouchers to non-public, non-chartered schools. So in essence, you could open up a school in your home and have children do chores all day and get that voucher money. There's no metrics for these schools. There's literally no oversight for these schools. They could be teaching Mein Kampf. That could be, the sum total of their education, and we would be paying public funds towards those schools. It's terrifying.
Yeah, I think I agreed. The only thing I'll add is sort of the charter schools did get more money. They got it primarily, and these are two separate issues, right? The charter school and the voucher issues are distinct. Charter schools got more money through the amount of money they get per pupil in terms of what's called facility funding. So it was $1,000 per kid. It went up to $1,500 per kid. It's a pretty substantial jump. So that's where most of the increase for charters came from. On vouchers, the Speaker of the House a few years ago tied the voucher amount to the amount that goes to public schools. So you can't increase K-12 funding without increasing vouchers in terms of the actual amount of the voucher. So the voucher amount, because K-12 was kept flat, the voucher amount actually didn't go up very much. So it went up some, but the big fight on vouchers was 2 years ago. We lost. What they're doing now is just expanding it to the types of schools Karen mentioned, and then they're finding ways to increase funding for charter schools. But the the problem is just as big as it was 2 years ago, but this was not the budget where they made those moves. They made most of those moves 2 years ago. This is the budget where those moves are continuing.
I guess where I was going was that the 70 counties that don't have charter schools, their funding is being taken away. And do they realize that the Republicans are doing that to their counties, the places that they represent?
We can make the argument that their funding is getting taken away, but their funding is getting taken away in the sense that all money is fungible. It's not like you're taking it from one fund to another. It's not like there's one specific, it's all coming from the general revenue fund. So could the money be spent on K-12 schools? Yes, of course. That's where it should be spent. But it's not technically you're drawing down here and you have to give it here, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think
can I ask a clarifying question here?
Yeah.
So
Sure, Bruce.
if you live in one of those, well, in any district where your kid is enrolled in public schools and you decide to send your kid to a charter, does this include parochial school?
Yes.
That is, the vouchers, they apply to parochial schools as well, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if the kid moves to a parochial or charter school from a public school, does the public school get less money because that kid is no longer enrolled in that district?
If we were using a school funding formula, they would. Because all the districts are getting flat funded, technically it wouldn't matter.
I see. Okay, that's helpful. I had dinner last night with a former teacher in a very rural district in Northwest Ohio, and they had kids in their school who, when the vouchers came in 2 years ago, they withdrew their kids from public school in these rural counties in Northwest, and they sent their kids to a private or parochial school in Toledo, 40 miles away. Crazy.
Most 93% of the uptake in the increase in vouchers from the last budget went to students who were already enrolled in private schools. So this is where, like, it actually, I only have one school district that I represent besides the Archdiocese, which is Cincinnati Public. And so as far as like the impact of Cincinnati Public, that happened 10, 15 years ago, right? The problem is we're blowing $1 billion subsidizing private school education for families who already made the choice and don't need it. And by the way, the money is mostly going to tuition hikes, right? Because what do you do if what the state said to every single private school, it's just like in any marketplace. The state said to every single private school in the state, we're about to give an extra $5,000 to $8,000 to all of your families. So what did every school do? And I got emails from constituents about this when it was happening in real time. They sent extremely aggressive mailers and emails to all the parents, and they said, you have to apply for the vouchers. And then they basically said, we'll split the difference with you. So you're getting a voucher for $5,000. We'll increase tuition by $3,000. You can keep $2,000, right? And so it's an unbelievable use of $1.5 billion of state
Thank
money.
you.
I think Rob had a question. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I was, as Dan indicated earlier, I'm on Facebook, and I got a Facebook post this morning from a Republican I know in Indiana, but he's not a MAGA, but he's fairly reasonable. But he was posting about the success of the private school tuition program in Ohio. And he was talking about how it's helping African Americans in rural districts, how it's helping low-income people, how the scores of the students are so much better than what's the outcomes from public schools. And of course, I responded because, as a former teacher, I've been through this. I've worked with Steve Dyer before. I get his emails all the time. And I tried to find it just before this meeting so I could quote the source of the study, but they had apparently taken it down. But it so disturbs me that this kind of false news is prevalent. And I'm wondering how much more difficult does it make your guys' job in trying to deal with this issue in the legislature?
Extremely. The amount of misinformation and disinformation is not just to the public, it's also within their caucus. And you know, Greg, back to your question about, are people noticing that their schools are losing money in these rural communities who are represented by the supermajority? There is such an intense culture war and villainization of education in total that it's really masking the funding. And when they villainize educators, they call them indoctrinators. They dismiss, you know, the benefits of critical thinking and, you know, vilify DEI. It really is a lot of layers to dig through. And when they're villainizing these, you know, sort of social issues and working against information, meanwhile, the schools have been struggling. You know, they have been struggling financially, and they're maybe not meeting the mark. It sort of feeds into, it's that grain of truth that feeds into the false narrative. And so they blame DEI, they blame, you know, the LGBT plus community. They blame educators for the problems that are happening in education. So it is very disturbing.
Okay.
Sue, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I think that this is a national movement, obviously, and Ohio seems to be the leader, maybe next to Texas in this movement. And so you have to, the question has to be who's behind it and it's not about education. That much we can rule out because there have been enough private, public, investigative reporting on when you compare schools and children's achievements or you know, test scores or a number of factors. When you compare children from the same community going to private versus public schools come out better. It's consistent. So they quit. They don't use test scores quite as much as they used to justify this. Originally, test scores were used to justify it. But in my opinion, as a former teacher, in my opinion, the test scores were created as a way to prove public schools were failing, when in fact, public schools weren't failing. Public schools were dealing with different clientele, had a different mission, were there to educate every child, not just the chosen. And you know, this privatization movement, I think it's money. I can't help but think it's money that's behind it, because of course money rules this country. But there's a lot of money, taxpayer money, that goes into education. And there's private interest, including the Archdiocese, who want that money. And they don't want to be held accountable. And in Ohio, there's no audit for what happens to the money. It goes straight to the private schools. They don't have any public auditing required. And then, of course, it's taxpayer money. What is the purpose of a public school? Is for the common good. Private schools have a totally different mission. They're there to educate a select clientele, and they don't have to educate everybody. There's such a distortion in understanding that even what the common good is and why we need that, because it's gotten lost in the message of failure versus success. Well, what creates, you could go on and on about these fine details, but this is a scam, and it's nationwide, and it's a movement, and it's very dangerous, because we're going to end up, especially Ohio is declining when it comes to education, and we're going to end up with a class of people who don't have access to education if we keep going like this. And of course, the corporate world already exploits its workers, but it's easier to exploit the uneducated. So
let's let Karen and Dani respond to your comments.
Yeah.
I think we both probably agree.
Yeah. And it was a process. Governor Voinovich started this road in the 1990s to get private vouchers. So this has not happened quickly. How do we move ourselves out of it? And that's really where, Dani and I and the rest of our caucus are working incredibly hard to do that. It's very challenging in the current climate.
So do you see any positives going on out there in that regard? I'm having trouble seeing any.
Yeah, I do. And Dani, I'd actually would love it if I know you worked on getting some of these changes into the budget, which were good for education. So would you share with us? You got some good stuff.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, and then I want to make sure we get to the two other questions so we can maybe get them all out there. But the biggest things in education that we got it's what we avoided. We avoided draconian cuts. And there was really harmful language around what to do about unused school buildings. Basically, there's an effort to try and force school districts to sell their schools to charter schools, the buildings, even the ones they're using. So we got that language out of there. We mitigated some of the harmful language around what they were going to do with some of the testing. The stuff around evaluating private schools does matter and is a step in the right direction. We'll see if it survives in the Senate. But most of the good things in the budget happened outside of that space. There were some good things in criminal justice reform that, like, sort of the Judiciary Committee, the Lawyer Committee was able to get, particularly as it relates to juvenile justice. I was able to get a housing bill in the budget that I'm really excited about, that I'm hoping can survive in the Senate. We got some good, some decent things actually in childcare that Rep. Brownlee worked on, an additional $100 million from what the governor had proposed into childcare. We got, and again, none of this happens without sort of us pushing as hard as we could on it. We got expanded access to doula coverage in the 6 biggest counties, which is great. So there were a couple things within Medicaid in terms of applying for waivers for people in the criminal justice system that, if it happens, would be good. There was a big hospital Medicaid package that really would have threatened federally qualified health centers and would have been quite harmful to UC Health and some of the lower income community providers that we were able to try and negotiate sort of a healthier landing spot for some of the entities that serve lower income communities. So we had to pick our battles to some extent, but we did. We got some things in there.
Okay. shot. Been very patient. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of things. I was a teacher many, many years ago, and I think I was probably still teaching when charter schools came into effect. The basic idea among teachers was it was started to try and mitigate the power of teachers' unions. So that was the way they were going to do it.
That's for
Okay.
sure.
Number two, I graduated from St. X here in 1968. There were 1,250 students, and about half were on some kind of tuition assistance. I get a quarterly bulletin from St. Xavier, 4 times a year. And about a year ago, they sent me this thing going, now 90% of St. X students get vouchers. There are like 1,350 students. And I don't think it's ever really varied much between the 1,250 and 13. So it wasn't like they weren't getting students. And plus the fact, I think it was Harry Fath 2 years ago, gave St. X $50 million. So the idea that that many students at St. X needs vouchers is a joke. I mean, I went to school with Barry Williams, whose father owned Williams Ford, Dave Kim, whose father owned Kim Chevrolet in Hamilton. I went to school, not everybody had money, truly, but there were a lot of people with a fair amount of money. And the idea that 90% of St. X students need vouchers is just a joke.
I'd like to address the workers, the attack on workers, and that was in a separate bill that was passed without a single Democrat vote a few weeks ago, which was SB1. And again, hiding under the layers of, the DEI and manufactured culture wars, that bill was truly an attack on workers, and it is taking away collective bargaining and striking rights from the folks who work in higher education. And so again, taking that culture war that higher education is filled with these elitist eggheads who are indoctrinating our kids, and the bottom line of SB1 is taking away workers' rights. And of course, our concern is once it happens, this is happening in one sector that's easy to pick on, but it normalizes it and sets it up for other sectors.
Dan, did you have a question?
Yes, it's sad to hear that what you have to go through as a Democrat is to teach the Republicans what's in their bills in order to persuade them to maybe to lighten up on some stuff. But it's also kind of disappointing. It was disappointing to me. I remember when seeing some statistics, like 800 people would testify at a committee hearing against Senate Bill 1 and maybe 11 for it. And yet the thing skates right through Congress. That's just really disappointing to hear that type of thing, understand that that's happening. So my question is, how do you think citizens, what's the best way for them to have an impact, in your opinion, on the system? Or is that one of the ways?
It is hearing from you and getting this outpouring, and it's exhausting. And Dani, hopefully I can speak for you too. This process is exhausting because we just have to fight and fight, and they keep, they throw so much, they're flooding the channel, right? And so it doesn't give a lot of options, but making your voices heard and continuing to speak out, continuing to call and email state reps and state senators. We like to hear from you. But, for those who, there were people with SB1 who got up and basically said they didn't have any calls in opposition to that bill. You can do a public records request on that. Let's at least not make it easy for them to just steamroll through and show them that we notice. Of course, the other option is, citizen-led referenda and ballot initiatives, but it takes a lot of time and effort to do those things. My take on it is stay the course, don't be quiet, don't obey in advance, because it just makes it easier for them to do it. Dani may have a different take on that.
No, I mean, I do think being informed and like not letting, it's very tempting to just say it's too much, it's overwhelming, I'm out. And that is a version of obeying in advance. And it's human nature, I get it. But what we really need people to do is to not give in to that impulse, maybe every once in a while, but to be willing to sort of keep digging in on, to know that Medicaid expansion is at risk, to bring it up with people who who utilize Medicaid expansion or who work in the hospitals that provide it, right? Do they know that that's on the chopping block, that the governor put it on the chopping block, that, that it's not too late, that we can be fighting to defend 800,000 of the most vulnerable people in Ohio's healthcare coverage? And by the way, the state loses money if we don't have it, right? Because we're on the hook for uncompensated care. That's how it used to be. And so Can I
interrupt there? Because that's a really important point, Dani, that when you are talking to other people, if the other party is saying that they are fiscally responsible, this budget, this is just some, highlights of the budget, does not support that whatsoever. What Dani just said, I think, is huge. If we cut Medicaid, we will still have sick people and they will still go to emergency care. We will still be covering it. That is not good financial sense, which is why Governor Kasich, who is a fiscal conservative, expanded Medicaid in the first place. I'm sorry to interrupt, Dani. It's a very good point.
No. So that's, I think, and we just, and that means we keep showing up and we keep making sure they know that we know that we're paying attention. And there will be opportunities to push back on this stuff. I do think, I know this meeting's being recorded, so you can hold me to this, but I hope you don't. But I do. I think at some point we've reached the point in Ohio. It's actually, I know someone said that it's us in Texas. Texas does not have a voucher scheme like we do. We are the forefront in the country. Texas tried to have a voucher scheme like we do, and it failed. So we are, and this has been going on for 20 years. We are the vanguard of the privatization of public education. There have already been discussions about using public funds to build private schools in the rural counties that don't have them. And at some point, I think in the near future, in the next 1 to 3 years, we will need to take the issue of school funding and property taxes directly to voters, because the legislature has proved incapable of legislating on those two issues.
Well, it's only been unconstitutional for 28 years or something like that. The Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. So talking about going to your state reps, like my rep would be Cecil Thomas. So, and he and I know agree on 95% of the stuff. So me calling him, I feel like I'm just beating a dead horse at that point. So should I be calling Cecil or should I be calling Cindy Abrams and complaining to her so she can't get up and say that no one contacted me? Like, what's the best course of action? Just call your rep or call someone on the committee that's hearing the testimony?
All of the above. I mean, we do want to hear from you, because then we know what what's going on the ground and how many people are listening and paying attention. The library did an incredible job of publicizing the change in funding to literally everybody that walks in there. We had hundreds of calls, thousands of emails. Same for SB1. So at least we want to know what's going on. But, of course, if you want to say thank you for being such a great rep, we appreciate that too. But yeah, I say call the the other side, call the people, especially the chairs and vice chairs of committees, and let them know that that we're not going to go down without a fight. Like Denny said, if we are at the vanguard of privatizing schools and we just roll over without a fight, where does that leave the rest of the country? They need to hear from us. They need to see us.
Gotcha. Rob, you had a question.
Yes. First of all, I want to say that I can partially relate to what both of our reps on this call are dealing with, because I started my political career in conservative southeastern Ohio, and I spent time in Hamilton County. Then I was 11 years in Lebanon, and even Montgomery was a lot redder 10 years ago. But having said that, I just want to thank both of you, because what I dealt with was nothing compared with what you deal with every single day. And I just admire your ability to just hang in there. And Karen, I want to apologize because I should be communicating with you often, but I think you're doing a fabulous job. But I do have a question for Dani. You indicated how horrible the budget was, and I don't doubt it for a minute, and that you were able to make some changes. I'm curious about with the supermajority that they have, what kind of leverage do we have? How are you able to get those kinds of things done?
So it's a good and fair question, and the answer is sort of where I will have to close because I have a hard stop at 7:30. But our job is twofold, and this is how we view it as Democratic caucus. Within the legislative process, because we are in the super minority, our job is to do whatever we can to make bad bills less bad, to serve our constituents by, heading things off when we can, to get anything bipartisan passed that we can. And most of that's not in the news. Most of it no one will ever know about, because how do you know that we made something bad less bad, right? But that's our job. That's what we owe the people we represent. Our job is, the second piece of our job is, we need to make the case that we are representing our values and that we have a different vision for the state, and that the state doesn't have to choose this path, that we don't have to have single party rule, right? And that's the political communications, messaging, showing up, organizing, that's all of that work. And some of the legislation that we introduce is part of that, right? It's signaling we could have different leadership. But what you're asking about is, how does the first part work? And most of it is relationships. So I'll just give you a really concrete example on school funding. The school funding formula is pretty complicated. Not that many people know how it works. Very few legislators know how it works. And so that there's an entirely new leadership team on the Republican side, with the exception of the speaker. Not a single one of them have ever worked on a budget before. They've never been on the finance committee. So it's not a partisan thing. It's actually a lack of information. And so I have been able to build pretty good working relationships with every member of their leadership team that it took me a long time to do. And so then when it came to school funding, I was basically able to help them understand the issue. And that helps build trust. And a lot of this it's actually not all, it's a lack of, like, some of the policies, you can make them less bad because they didn't mean for them to do what they're doing, right? The best example I'll give you, and is a small one, but it's indicative of, we did this in 100 different instances. On doula coverage, they added a provision to cap the total spend on doula coverage, and to say that it could only be spent on the counties with the highest amount per capita of births per capita, basically, that need this. Or infant deaths per capita, sorry. Well, what they were trying to get at was that they wanted it only to apply in the big counties. But if you do it on a per capita basis, the counties that it actually went to were the 6 of the smallest rural counties in the state. And the $500,000 cap was, they meant it to be, that should be the state's contribution cap, not the total spend cap, because there's a 3-to-1 federal match. And so if you make it the total cap, then actually you're saying you can only spend like $157,000 in these 6 rural counties that don't even have doulas. So because we spotted that and we understand the issue, and because, and I'll give Representative Baker her due, because Rachel Baker put in an incredible amount of time to have a good working, trusting relationship with the chair of the Medicaid committee, when she pointed that out to her and rewrote it to be what they actually wanted it to do, which is have a $1.5 million cap and have it be in the 6 largest counties, they accepted that change. So, like, our job on the legislation side, and this is to just do 200% of the work and present sort of the most rational, logical thing, like to honestly, because there are Republicans who care about public education. There's a lot of them. There's former teachers. There's they don't know anything about private and charter schools in their communities, right? They actually don't know a lot about how public education funding works. And so they're really open if you have a trusting friendship and relationship with them, they're open to you telling them, here's what this is going to do to your school. And so you can do that on a million different issues, but the work, the public service part, the part on behalf of our constituents is putting the time in to build those relationships.
Thank you.
So I do have to, sorry that I have a hard stop at 7:30, but I love this group. And you can reach out to me sort of individually too. It doesn't have to be in a group setting. I'll put a couple of my contact things.
Hey, Dani, thanks so much. You're doing a great job. Karen, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Really,
Thank you all very much. And thanks for all of your support and all the amazing things you guys are doing out in the community. I'll put my contact info in there too. 28.
Thanks, Dani. It was good seeing you.
Yeah.
Great to see you guys. And we love this work.
Mhm.
We love doing it, and we remain. They will never ever take our optimism from us. That is one thing they can't control. And so we believe it can be better, and we are enjoying getting to work to make it better.
If you
Great.
ever need our help for anything, please let Dan know, like send Dan an email or something, or me an email, and I'll let everybody know that we need to organize around such and such an issue or something. So if we can push anything for you, we'll be glad to do that.
Great, thank you. And please follow us. I mean, I know it's annoying, but follow us on social media. It's just the easiest way for us to get information out quickly, but we definitely will reach out to you. So
Great.
thank you all so much for having us tonight.
Thank you.
Honey, I know you have to take off, but Karen, do you want to stay for just one more quick second? I think Schott might have one last question for us.
Okay, I do one more question, yes.
Okay, it's not a question. Utah has the same problem with vouchers, and their constitution is written the same way as Ohio. The Supreme Court in Utah said you cannot do this. They just stopped it last week. Arizona has vouchers, and they don't have a cap, just like Ohio did. Last year, they blew through a lot of money. They had to go back and cut their highway fund because they didn't put a cap on the voucher.
And unfortunately, that's where we're heading. And so we're just dedicated to continuing to fight and learn and understand so we can move the needle. But again, we need your support. So I can't thank you enough for what you do.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. I can't put my question in. I've had my hand up. I got to say one last thing.
Okay, and is it a quick question? I do have to run. I'm
yes,
so sorry.
it is.
Okay.
It is.
Okay.
I won't ramble on this time. It's what do they say, and how do they justify not requiring audits for how the money is used when they send it to private and parochial schools?
So again, just echoing what Denny said, a lot of the members in the supermajority don't understand what's in the budget, and they don't do the work to understand it. So what Denny was saying happens every day, where for my instance, my tangible, evidence of it was I was talking with a member from the supermajority. He did not understand. He kept saying, no, with public libraries, we're actually giving them more money. We're not cutting their funds. And I had to explain to him the change in funding going from a formula or, a budget percentage to a flat funding and what that's going to look like. And it's changing what they're planning on. He just kind of blew me off. My Democratic colleague explained it to him a different way. I don't think he got the message. We somehow circled back to this again, and he looked at me and he said, maybe I just don't understand it. I'll have to go back and look. So that is a real situation. So planting that, we are doing our best to give them the information, plant those seeds of trusting us to come to us for information so we can change that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Keep it up for democracy.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Karen.
Karen.
Everybody.
We'll see you at the next rally, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Dan and